Greetings to all the fighters, commissars, and all the progressive forces in all parts of the world. Today's presentation is going to focus on the transition of South Africa from colonialism and apartheid to what we currently have now, which we currently characterize as a neo-colonial capitalist state. So this discussion is going to look into history in terms of where do we come from as a people, so that we are able to understand perfectly why we have the conditions economically that we have currently, where we have an economy that is still owned and controlled by the white minority, by the white capitalist minority. And it is important always to reflect on history. We are taking a lesson from Marcus Garvey, who says that a people without knowledge of their history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. So we want to root our discussions properly on the understanding of history so that we are able to understand the conditions that define us currently. There are so many narratives that define and begin to characterize South Africa's transition from apartheid to what we currently have, which already we have said is a neo-colonial capitalist state. How did we get here? And what is to be done to change the things that we got to inherit from the colonial and apartheid past? How did we get here and how do we change that? So this is a presentation that is going to focus on those areas. And as part of that discussion, we are going to turn upside down there's so many myths and urban legends that exist about South Africa's history and transition from apartheid to the so-called democracy. One of the myths that we're going to overturn is a myth that the history of South Africa started in 1652 with the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck and the Dutch that got to subsequently colonize South Africa. And we're going to overturn that myth so that all of us understand where we come from as a people. It's important to do so. The second myth we're going to dismiss as well is a view that is contained in the Constitution of South Africa that almost suggests that the land dispossession of the black majority started with the passing of the Natives Land Act in 1913. And then the third myth that we're going to overturn is that the ruling party, the African National Congress, has always been a revolutionary movement, has always been a movement that is anti-colonial and fighting for the liberation of the people of South Africa. Such is not the case. We'll illustrate how that is not the case. The other myth that we're going to dismiss as well, and it's important to do so, it's a myth that racist legislations and racism only started with the beginning of apartheid in 1948. We'll then explain what is the context of such a narrative, dominant narrative that defines South Africa's history currently. But also we're going to dismiss a myth that says that the transition to democracy or so-called democracy in 1994 ended white domination. You know, the famous speech of former President Nelson Mandela says that I fought against black and white domination. And then when he took oath of office as president, the first president of South Africa, he repeated that component of I fought against black domination and against white domination. I do not even know which one is black domination in this particular context. The other myth that we're going to dismiss is that we had a peaceful transition in South Africa. The other myth that we're going to dismiss as part of this presentation is that the ANC, the ruling party, is the only vehicle to transform society. That is going to then give us a clearer and better understanding of the transition from apartheid to what we have now. And we want to highlight something important, that almost all historians, the master narrative that defines the history of South Africa starts in 1652 with the arrival of colonialists. And that is not the case. We had societies that were organized amongst the indigenous people, black South Africans, Africans who had life of their own, who had systems of trade. The history of Mapungubwe, which was a society which was even involved in mining of gold and a variety of other important economic activities, which was also involved in trade. There's an institute, the liberal institute that exists in South Africa that calls itself the Mapungubwe Institute of Research. And it doesn't begin to give a clearer context of the fact that Africa, South Africa, the place we call South Africa today, had life long before the arrival of colonialists in 1652. But also there is an important part of history that is ignored in terms of attempts of the colonial invaders to take South Africa. And that event is an event that happened in 1510, the defeat of Francisco de Almeida, who was one of the most feared generals of the Portugal Empire, the Portuguese Empire. Now, just to give a clearer context of that, is that there's something called long cycle theory, which basically is a theory that illustrates that the most powerful nation in the world mostly lasts for between 70 and 100 years. So if you include wars, it goes for a longer period. So for the longest time in the 1400s until the late 1500s, Portugal was the most dominant force and the most dominant nation in the world. So the colonization that happened in Mozambique, the colonization of India, the colonization of many countries in Southern America was because Portugal occupied a dominant space. And as part of their trade voyages, they used to stop by the country we call South Africa today. They used to stop by the Cape. And in 1510, they made an attempt to dispossess the Khoi people who were staying in that particular part of South Africa. And Francisco de Almeida was defeated by the Khoi. He was killed in the battle which is called the Battle of Salt River. And most historians, they tend to ignore the fact that the wars of resistance started even before the arrival of the Dutch. And then later on, the Portuguese Empire was replaced by the Holland Empire, the Dutch Empire, that later on got to dominate South Africa, colonize South Africa, and many other parts of the world. And they were succeeded by the British Empire, which got to take over the colony of the Dutch from them and then made South Africa a colonial domination of the British Empire, which later on led to the Anglo-Boer War, or the South African War, where Britain reaffirmed its authority over South Africa and later on merged the 4 provinces into the Union of South Africa on the 31st of May 1910. So that historical context is important to give into perspective. But since the beginning of the Second World War, or since the end of the Second World War, the United States and the USSR were basically the 2 most dominant powers in the world. They determined the agenda of the areas which associated with them. So we had a world of bipolarity post-World War II, which ended effectively in the late 1940s. And that is what got to define the agenda. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union in between 1989 and 1991, the United States remained the most dominant force in the world. That is why you have got this Washington consensus that determines the policy content of almost all nations in the world. And in that period, which is the period of South Africa's transition from apartheid to what we have now, the Washington consensus was triumphalist. They were like very excited. They were very happy that their mode, their systems, their ideas, their ideology of development, which is neoliberalism, should determine any other part of the world that the manner in which goods are produced and distributed should be guided by neoliberalism, which is to say that all economies must be open, must be free market, you must allow capitalism to reign. So that is the context within which South Africa's transition took place. Now, the second myth which we had said we're going to then deal with is this myth that the ANC was always an anti-colonial movement. It was not. For a very long time, actually at formation, it was very reactionary. So you must go and read as we said in the other presentation, there's so many original documents and petitions of the ANC to the Queen or the King that time, King George V, when they were pleading for freedom of the African majority. They always reaffirmed the authority of the British Empire over the people of South Africa. The ANC took part in donating black people's lives to the First World War, and thousands of them died. The only event that is given much prominence in history is the sinking of the SS Mandy ship that sank when the soldiers were coming back from the World War. So imagine that here is an organization that says that they are an anti-colonial movement, but when there is a colonial war, there is an imperialist war of the world powers amongst themselves. An anti-colonial movement takes black people to go and fight on the side of Britain. So there's never been anything revolutionary about that. They were instead fighting for accommodation in the established British Empire. They actually always acknowledged and reaffirmed the power of the king over South Africa. All the petitions that they sent there were reaffirming the power of Britain. And that is one of the things that got to define them. But also, the ANC in history was not the only revolutionary resistance movement. There were so many other activities that got to happen that are not attributed, and the ANC cannot even claim victory over those major events. And one of those is the 21st of March 1960, Sharpeville Day, where Robert Sobukwe led a nationwide anti-pass campaign. Robert Sobukwe is one of the most important leaders in the struggle against colonialism and apartheid in South Africa, but his role is always undermined, it's always reduced to nothing, because the apartheid establishment was always fearful of Robert Sobukwe. That is why now you cannot find a video of Robert Sobukwe speaking anywhere. You can actually find videos of leaders from the ANC that were recorded far much before the era of Robert Sobukwe, because they were very scared of him. They destroyed everything that had to be associated with him because of the power that he possessed in terms of mobilization of the people, in terms of giving a clearer agenda of what should constitute the liberation of black people in South Africa. That is why even when he was in Robben Island, Robert Sobukwe was isolated from the rest, because they were very scared that he is going to politically and ideologically reproduce himself. They were very fearful of him in that particular context. But also the other important event that is always not told in clearer context is the 1976 June 16 uprisings. If you go and check the statement of the ANC in terms of that particular uprising, they condemned the young people who were courageous enough to confront the apartheid machinery, who were courageous enough to say, we cannot be forced to learn in Afrikaans. We actually think that apartheid must go. Not just Afrikaans, the entire establishment must be challenged with militancy. But the reaction of the ANC was to condemn the activities of young people. They actually said that was a reckless activity of young people. Now, I want to then take you back quickly to also what has been the dominant narrative. So, Verwoerd is seen as the architecture of apartheid because of him having played an important role in intensifying the racist laws over the black majority. But the architects of apartheid and racism in South Africa is the British Empire. It is the companies that were associated with the British Empire, the Anglo-Americans, like the companies that came from Cecil John Rhodes. Those are the ones that passed a lot of legislations. Those are the ones that inspired a lot of legislations that got to undermine the black people's existence as human beings. So throughout, black people were not considered as human beings. That is why they were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to do anything meaningful. They were just considered as a reserve that must be controlled and contained. But a narrative that is driven all over the world is that racism in South Africa started in 1948 with the election of the National Party. That is not the case. Prior to the apartheid establishment, which is the most nonsensical racist system, there were more than 100 legislations that prevented black people from doing so many things that were racist in character and nature. But you know, the Oppenheimer, Brandhurst narrative tends to say that apartheid only began, or racism only began in 1948. It's not the case. 1948 was just an intensification of the racist laws that got to define the territory we call South Africa today. And you would know that South Africa was a country that was conceived by an exclusively white Anglo-Boer war and negotiation afterward. The war involved all people. Black people fought mostly on the side of the British. And you can understand what happened, because majority of the people who were associating with colonialism, they did not see anything wrong with the British Empire and domination over South Africa. And black people then fought, and then the whites only agreed amongst themselves that they must unite the 4 provinces of Natal, Cape, Orange River Colony, and the Transvaal to form a union of South Africa. That is why you've got these split capital cities. So Bloemfontein was considered in the Orange River Colony as the judicial capital of South Africa, with the Supreme Court, the highest court, being situated there. It is still there today. And then the second capital was the administrative capital, which is Pretoria, to reaffirm Transvaal in the Union of South Africa. And then the third capital, the legislative capital, became Cape Town, to reaffirm the Cape's role in that Union of South Africa. And then Natal was actually given a deal, a completion of a railway project as part of that whites-only negotiation that did not include the black people. And then in reaction, the South African National Natives Congress, which is called the ANC now, was formed not to challenge the establishment, the architecture, the racist architecture, but to beg for participation within that system, to beg for participation of civilized black males in that particular context. It is important that we must highlight all those historical factors so that when we then talk to the transition, we understand very well. Now, after the 1976 uprising, there are so many things that happened. So politically, young people began to be much more militant and much more organized in terms of challenging the apartheid system. So in many parts of the world, in many parts of South Africa, I mean to say, the levels of militancy was now increased. Even the formation of COSAS in 1979 was now a recognition later on that young people have got capacity to could overthrow regimes. They can actually be a nucleus to challenge the existing order. So the formation of COSAS in 1979 was to now accept the power that young people demonstrated in the Soweto uprisings, that began in Soweto under the leadership of Tsietsi Mashinini, of Khoso Siyahlulwa and many other revolutionary forces. And then, of course, you would know that a lot of young people at very early ages were exiled. A lot of them were killed. More than 500 of them were killed. Now, in reaction to 1976 uprisings, white capital, the white business establishment, realized that apartheid is losing legitimacy. And throughout history, capital relied on apartheid for the guarantee of supply of cheap labor, of cheap and easily disposable black labor. But then after 1976, they realized that this apartheid, the laws of apartheid that exclude black people, and now the prominence nationally and globally of the oppressive system of apartheid is going to undermine the profit motives and the profit maximization by established businesses. That is why in 1976, business, the capitalists, represented by the Oppenheimers and the Ruperts, started an organization called the Urban Foundation. The Urban Foundation was started in 1976 in December and had the participation of black people. And they were beginning to say that, no, let us help different black people, the black middle class, with housing, finance, and a variety of other interventions. And if you did not know, the first house of the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, was financed by the Urban Foundation. The Urban Foundation, which was started by Anton Rupert and Harry Oppenheimer, who are the biggest representative of capital in the world. And there's an interesting thing that was said by Anton Rupert when he was closing that conference, the founding conference of the Urban Foundation. He said that, no, we must not bury our heads in the sand. We must now appreciate that there is so many things happening in South Africa. And if we do not engage as business in all these activities, we are going to have a situation where, which is reflective of Rome, where Rome fell into the hands of barbarians. He actually used that word to say that this is how Rome fell into the hands of barbarians. Now, the Urban Foundation had the original offices, and then in 1978, Cyril Ramaphosa was included in the board of the Urban Foundation in the Transvaal region as part of the people that were participating there. And how did he get there? Is because although he was detained as part of the mass detentions post-1976, he was detained, Cyril Ramaphosa was detained for about 6 months. But later on, because of the interventions of a family, the Woodhouse family, he was then introduced to the Menel family. So the Menel family was the owners of the Angloval mines. They were one of the biggest capitalist families in the world, in South Africa in particular, which had proximity to the state, which had power to then influence a variety of things. So the Menel family started a platform called Synthesis, where they used to involve apartheid leaders and black leaders to participate in that particular platform, with a view that they will make much easier accessible these black leaders. The people that used to participate in that platform included Tato Montlana, Dr. Tato Montlana, and it included the leader of the IFP, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, used to be invited to participate in that platform. It included Cyril Ramaphosa. That is why he was later on included in the Urban Foundation. It is important to highlight that component. So Synthesis used to discuss the politics of South Africa with black people. And you will know later on, the current president of South Africa played a role in the formation of the National Union of Mine Workers with the approval of the Oppenheimers. Because if the capitalist establishment did not agree on formation of a union, of a black union, it was not going to happen. So there was nothing really revolutionary. It was because the capitalist establishment, the Oppenheimers, in particular realized that when workers are not organized into a union, it's very difficult to engage with them. And in any way, these workers are too many. So let us have an organization that is we're going to be able to gain access to in terms of what should happen. Now, Anglo-American had vested interests in the future of South Africa because Anglo-American effectively owned almost all businesses in South Africa. Not only in South Africa, but in Botswana, in Namibia, in Rhodesia, like in a country which Cecil John Rhodes named after himself, which is Zambia and Zimbabwe currently. They had control of almost all major corporations. The South African breweries, there was a time where Anglo-American had more employees than the entire state combined, all its employees, but Anglo-American only was the dominant force that had vested interest in the economy of South Africa. And that is why the formal engagement with the ANC started in 1985 when the chairperson of Anglo-American that time, called Gavin Reilly, led a delegation to go and meet the ANC under the leadership of Oliver Tambo in Zambia. And they were discussing economic policy issues to say, if we were to give you guys power, what are you going to do? Are you going to take our mines? Are you going to chase out into the sea? And their assessment from that meeting in 1985 was that actually these people are not the terrorists which apartheid state institutions are saying they are. We can engage with them. We can engage with them and with a view that we'll later on have a substitution of apartheid politicians with black politicians and continue to do business as usual. So one of the workers of Anglo-American that time is a guy called Clem Santa. He wrote an interesting perspective in 1987 to say that we need to push as Anglo-American that there must be negotiation for a transition from apartheid to an inclusive system. And then he then said that at the end, negotiation must work, rhetoric must be dropped, reality must prevail, and in the end, the companies concerned must continue to produce minerals, goods, and services. That was the vision of Anglo-American in terms of what happened. And to highlight these economic interests of the capitalist establishment is not to undermine or understate the many other factors that played a role in pushing the apartheid government into the negotiation table for what we have as a transition, the CODESA processes, the release of political prisoners, and so on and so forth. The mobilization, the massive mobilization on the ground, the militancy of the youth who had made it their role to make the apartheid machinery unworkable and the system ungovernable, played an important role in and also creating the instability which was always responded to with states of emergency, mass arrests, and a variety of other harassments that got to happen, mass killings of our people in terms of what happened. But also the other important components that played an important role in pushing the apartheid government to later on go to negotiate officially with the liberation movements was the Battle of Quito Carnaval. So the Battle of Quito Carnaval was fought in Angola in a small town, small village actually of Quito Carnaval. And the significant part about that battle is because the Cubans came with more than 50,000 soldiers to fight on the side of liberation forces. And the opponents of the war was the South African Defense Force, the Apartheid Defense Force, and they were defeated in that battle. And the culmination of Quito Carnaval was a negotiation that involved the United States of America because it was a global power. They were actually claiming to be the moderator. It involved the the Cuban Republic, it involved Angola. And as outcome of that discussion was that the apartheid South Africa must leave Namibia, which they had occupied, as part of a sub-colonial arrangement. So after the Germans left what we call Namibia today, it was called Southwest Africa in terms of the definition that time. That is why the main liberation movement is called the SWAPO. It's Southwest African Organization, People's Organization. So that is what happened then. The negotiation post Quito Carnival was that the apartheid government must allow for the independence of Namibia. And the Cubans made it very clear that on the 22nd of December 1988 that apartheid must go into a negotiation table with the liberation movements so that there is a transition in South Africa to an inclusive system that includes all people in terms of participation in election and everything else. And that's why that tripartite agreement was reached without the participation, of course, of the liberation movements in terms of what happened. So this is just to highlight that there were so many other aspects that were playing a role, but the economic interests of the establishment also influenced the apartheid machinery, the sanctions, the anti-apartheid internationalist movements and campaigns in many parts of the world, in many parts of Europe, in America. Like Reverend Al Sharpton was one of the key leaders of the anti-apartheid movements in America, who were actually calling for the boycott of the diamonds which are produced by the Oppenheimers. So you could realize that in that particular context, a lot of businesses, the dominant business in South Africa, was beginning to lose legitimacy globally. So they had interest in the transition that got to happen here in South Africa in terms of the politics. Now, with all these pressures, in 1990, de Klerk then announced on the 2nd of February the unbanning of all political parties and the release of all political prisoners from prison. And the significant part was the release of Nelson Mandela. And you would know that earlier they had released Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, and other leaders who were arrested as part of the Rivonia trial. So Nelson Mandela was released officially from prison in 1990, although he had spent about 18 years in Robben Island. And then the remaining part, he was staying in a house in Pollsmoor. And during the period prior to 1990, the apartheid establishment was always engaging with former President Nelson Mandela to test whether he is going to chase all whites into the sea if he takes over power, and what is his relationship with the Communist Party, which they always suspected is the ideological foundation of the ANC at that time, and whether he's going to nationalize the mines, whether he's going to take the land. So there were so many negotiations. So there is no clarity in terms of what is the outcome of those negotiations that happened in the house in Cape Town, which later on is included as part of the prison years. Well, we can say that, yeah, it's part of the 27 prison years, but it was staying in a house, discussions and from Pollsmoor prison, from the house that he was accommodated at. So there was so many interest in terms of what happened. Now, the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990 then gave space for a lot of contestation of how a future South Africa must look like. What should be the economics? What should be the politics? What should be the structure of a post-apartheid South Africa? So different groupings had different interests. The homelands had their own interests. the international community had their own interest. The International Monetary Fund in particular began to come closer to South Africa because they wanted to impose the Washington neoliberal consensus. And then because of the drought in early 1992, they then offered a loan of 850 million US dollars to the Transitional Executive Council, like the South African government at that time, and set clear conditionalities of how the economy of South Africa should look like. But what is interesting as well is that with his private difficulties, Nelson Mandela was then introduced to the Minel family. The Minel family is the one that had adopted Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa far much earlier in the 70s. He was then introduced, and then a discussion forum was started, chaired by former President Nelson Mandela and Harry Oppenheimer, called the Brenthurst Group. So Brenthurst Group is an estate in Johannesburg where the Oppenheimers are staying. They've got a library, they've got an institution there. And they've got an institution that drives the Oppenheimer's narrative of South Africa's history. Like that says, that wants to exonerate Anglo-American in its role and participation in enactment of racist policies. There's a person called Greg Mills. He's associated with that institution. But also they've got relations with many other ideological liberal institutions that seek to influence the perspective of how we view history and how we view society moving forward. So President Mandela, with other leaders of the ANC, began to participate in the Brenthurst Group in terms of what should happen to the economy and so on and so forth. And we do not know the outcome of that discussions, but maybe what we have now is the outcome of that discussion. Maybe the first cabinet of President Nelson Mandela has got anything to do with, or everything to do with the Brenthurst discussions. And how do you see that? Is that the first Minister of Finance was Derek Keys, who used to work for the Ruperts. And the first Minister of Finance under President Mandela. And then he was succeeded by Chris Liebenberg, who used to work for Nedbank. And the Minister of Mineral Resources, the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy was Big Botha. So these are the key components of the economy. So finance, minerals and energy, Big Botha. The Minister of Land was Kry van Niekerk. So land is with part of this government of national unity. Kry van Niekerk. The mineral resources and energy, which is a very important component of South Africa's economy, and something called the Minerals Energy Complex, was Big Botha. And then the Minister of Finance was Derek Keys, later on Chris Liebenberg. And then later on was succeeded by Trevor Manuel, who had very close relations with the Oppenheimers. Go and read the authorized biography of Trevor Manuel. The first legal meeting of the ANC after unbanning happened in Vergelegen, a wine farm owned by the Oppenheimers. And who was at the center of organizing such a meeting in Vergelegen was Trevor Manuel. Actually, it says in his authorized biography that, let's go to Vergelegen. He said that I actually did not, people did not know where the meeting is going to take place. And at the end, Trevor Manuel then came to say, Vergelegen, let's go. So the first legal meeting of the ANC after unbanning took place in Vergelegen. That is confirmed in the authorized biography of Trevor Manuel. So it makes sense that after the National Party pulled out of the government of national unity, he then became the Minister of Finance, who had a very significant say in both micro and macroeconomics, but also in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy of the state in terms of what happened. But also because that period was highly contested. a lot of ANC leaders, the economic department of the ANC was inducted by the World Bank, by the IMF, and a variety of other institutions to then want to baptize them into neoliberalism. That includes Tito Mboweni, the current minister of finance. It included Maria Ramos and a variety of other people who later on embraced neoliberalism as a way of organizing South Africa's economy. So that contestation was always there. But also from the left, you had a contestation that came through a group of progressive left economists. Like a lot of them were involved there. Then they produced a document called Making Democracy Work, which is a framework for macroeconomic policy in South Africa. So it was called the Macroeconomic Research Group. The Macroeconomic Research Group then developed an alternate set of policies of what forms of economic policy should South Africa pursue post new elections in terms of what gets to happen. But it is very evident that the neoliberal agenda overcame this, because this did not come the foundation of South Africa's democracy since the elections. But also, there is something very interesting that the organization called the World Trade Organization now used to be called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And South Africa signed the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs on the 24th of April 1994. So that is 3 days before elections in terms of what happens. So this contestation, but later on, were then forced into a neoliberal economic framework even before elections took place. And you would know that another thing that happened during that period was the creation of the Ingonyama Trust. The Ingonyama Trust Act was signed a day before elections on the 26th of April 1994, which basically transferred all the homeland, like all the land that belonged to the KwaZulu homeland, into the control of the Ingonyama Trust, whose sole beneficiary or custodian is Silo Samabandla, the king of the Zulu nation, King Goodwill Zwelithini. It's part of the negotiations that happened. But also something very reactionary that happened during that period was the signing of an agreement between the Freedom Front and the ANC that Afrikaners can form a government of their own, a nation of their own, even under a constitutional democracy. Currently, Section 235 of South Africa's Constitution gives the right of any nation within South Africa to secede, meaning that they can go and constitute themselves into a separate nation within the democratic state. That is what they were assured as part of those compromises in terms of what got to happen. But also the contestation that defined that period also happened at a global level, because when President Mandela went to the World Economic Forum in Davos in 1992, he was engaged in a variety of discussions with the delegations from China, from Vietnam, and then the narrative now is that he then got to change his perspective because of the persuasion by the Vietnamese and Chinese delegation. Because when he was released from prison, in almost all his interviews and economic policy articulations, President Mandela used to say that nationalization of mines is ANC policy, and any change to such a policy is inconceivable. But after 1992, he then began to say, no, this thing of nationalization will not work. This thing of the Freedom Charter commitments are not going to happen. You must look into a book by Ben Turok, who was part of the discussions in all ANC conferences. He illustrates how sometimes even without democratic permission, a neoliberal agenda will just be imposed on the ANC that no, this thing of nationalization is going to cause chaos in terms of what happened. And it's not an easy thing, because you are living in a world which has just seen the collapse of a Soviet bloc, the socialist bloc, where socialism is being trampled upon. They say that thing doesn't work. And then these discussions, so many concessions are made in terms of what happens. And the biggest position that got to define that period was later on the agreement on the property clause, which is section 25 of the Constitution currently, which protects stolen property. So that property clause is a stolen property clause to say that we know that colonialism and apartheid has dispossessed Black Africans, the indigenous people of their land, but let us have a constitutional clause that protects stolen property. That is what it is in terms of the property clause, which even says that those who want to reclaim or want to have some land restitution must only focus on the period post-1913, June 1913. Because prior to June 1913, almost the whole of South Africa the land was already taken by the white establishment. But the Constitution of South Africa protects such that if you want to change that clause, it's even much made more difficult, that you need 2/3 majority in parliament, an agreement of 6 provinces to change that clause. We are in the process of changing that. We hope that we're going to achieve what 1994, this transition that many people celebrate, got to happen. But also during that period, there is more than 20,000 people that were killed in the apartheid government-sponsored violence, mostly between those who were associated with the ANC and the IFP. More than 20,000 people were killed. But you will hear people saying that South Africa experienced a peaceful transition. Why do they call it a peaceful transition? It's because no white people were killed. Only Black people were killed in that period. So if white lives are not being lost, it's a peaceful transition. There are so many people who say, no, peaceful transition. Peaceful transition where when 20,000 people have been killed in a period between 1990 and 1994. It's part of the things that we need to tell in clarity so that we are able to then deal with this thing differently. But also the other difficulty that characterized the transition is the fact that the white global establishment, the white racist global establishment and the major powers always undermined left leaders. They either had to remove you through a coup d'etat if you were articulating left progressive policies, or kill you. So Patrice Lumumba was killed, Thomas Sankara was killed, a lot of progressive leaders were killed. And in some instances, when there was a government which was against the global capitalist establishment, they would then sponsor a separate movement, like they did in Angola with UNITA, to destabilize, to have a civil war, so that there's no stability, like they did in Mozambique with Renamo, sponsored by also the apartheid government. And when President Mugabe took power in Zimbabwe, some of the resistance of ZAPU, which led to the so-called Matabeleland or the Matabeleland massacre, was also an attempt to suppress what has been counter-revolutions in Angola and Mozambique, in many parts of the world, in terms of how the system dealt to suppress a progressive movement. But comrades, the fact of the matter is that the transition was hijacked, one, by the local business capitalist elite in terms of policy content. So because since 1956, when the ANC adopted the Freedom Charter, the Freedom Charter was adopted in 1955 by the Congress of the People, and the ANC conference adopted in 1956. Then apartheid repression began to be much more vitriolic and much more brutal, because the Freedom Charter said, amongst other things, that the national wealth, the mineral wealth beneath the soil, the monopoly industries and banks shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. So the treason trial was mostly because the liberation movement had adopted a Freedom Charter, which was very clear in terms of policy articulation. Later on, even the Rivonia trial, like the Freedom Charter was a rallying point, a rallying cry in terms of what happened. And then, of course, there was a legitimate concern raised by the Africanist faction in the Congress movement that says that it looks like you're drifting away from the 1949 program of action. That was much more radical in terms of how we must carry the struggle against colonialism and apartheid, in terms of what happened. But the capitalist establishment, they said every time they were negotiating, read the Long Walk to Freedom, read all these negotiations that happened. The issue was the Freedom Charter. Do you still believe in the Freedom Charter? And they were able to substitute the Freedom Charter in the liberation movement with a new liberal policy framework, which later on gained prominence with the adoption of the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy, GEA 1996. But already a foundation had been laid that let us give you political power, but we're not going to give you economic power and control. The land must be protected through the Constitution. You must not take anything. You must not expropriate any sector of the economy, because the property clause is not just protecting the land, it is protecting the economic interests of the establishment in terms of what happened. And we have always said that political power without economic power means nothing, it's meaningless, in terms of what got to happen in that particular transition. So those are some of the key highlights in terms of what happened with South Africa's transition from colonialism and apartheid to what we currently have. There are so many things, comrades, there are so many books which you must read and familiarize yourselves with. Like when I made reference to the original documents of the ANC when it was a collaborationist movement for most part of its history, and currently it is still a collaborationist movement with the white capitalist establishment and global capitalism, you must go and get this book called From Protest to Challenge, which shows the delegation that went to London to go and beg the king for certain rights for certain people, and which always honored the majesty, your majesty. Every time the things that were said there was your majesty, your majesty. And the other book which is important to read as well is this book by Professor Saint-Pierre Blanche called Lost in Transformation. He details the meetings that took place between the ANC and business leaders to determine the economic policy content of the liberation movement post-democracy. I already have, and then in terms of these things that were said about the first house of the current president being financed by the Urban Foundation, which belongs to the Oppenheimers and the Ruperts, it's in his own biography, which is endorsed, by the way. And his participation in the Urban Foundation, his relationship with the Menel family, who are actually one of the recipients now of the orders, like the national orders. They were honored by President Ramaphosa because they had adopted him in the 70s. Maybe it explains why he didn't face police harassment when little children, young children, were always arrested and even killed by the apartheid system. He was always insulated because the establishment was not threatened by him, because they had access to him in the Urban Foundation and through synthesis a platform which was created to influence economic policy here in South Africa, then what is to be done? We need to reverse the agreements of white capital with the liberation movement. And the only way to do so is to defeat the ANC from power. We've got, South Africa is currently the most unequal society in the world. The poverty of black people, it's unbearable. So if you were to take white people in South Africa and gauge them in terms of their socio-economic indicators, unemployment, literacy levels, life expectancy, and a variety of other things, whites by themselves, they would be counted as part of the top 10 most developed nations in the world. And that inequality is not being reversed. And when we point to these realities, you have got leadership of the country that says, don't speak bad about investors. Investors where? These are the colonial apartheid looters who utilize legislation to guarantee their wealth, co-opted the leadership of the liberation movements. The first BEE deal was Tanto Montlana, who used to part of Synthesis, Cyril Ramaphosa, and companies that were associated with Anglo-American. Here in South Africa, we are not liberated. We do not have liberation because the establishment, the capitalist establishment domestically and globally, hijacked the content of our liberation from apartheid capitalism. And of course, there are commendable rights that have been given to black people who must always celebrate such. We must always say that this is proper liberation benefits, like the right to organize, like the right to say the things that we are saying now. Under apartheid, they would have arrested and possibly killed if you say something of this nature. But one thing that we must always learn and appreciate, comrades, is that nobody in the world, nobody in history has ever gotten freedom by appealing to the moral sense of the people who are oppressing them. That is what Assata Shakur says. But this liberation movement that is in power now, they have always believed that you can appeal to the moral sense of the oppressors. It starts with the formation of the organization itself. Every time that, please allow us to participate in the economy, please allow us some rights, and we will never achieve true liberation under the liberation movement that is in office now. They're just in office, they're not in power. They've got no control of the economy. That is why when we've got a crisis, the first address by the sitting president is to acknowledge the Oppenheimers and the Ruperts who donated 1 billion each to themselves. You know, and they say, no, we're going to borrow money to black businesses. What does that mean? It means that you borrow money to black businesses, and what will be the guarantee? It will be the shares in those businesses. It will be those businesses. And what will happen if the people who have been borrowed money by the Oppenheimers and the Ruperts can't pay back that loan? Those businesses, those small black businesses, small and medium enterprises, are going to be expropriated because of an establishment that controls our economy in terms of what happens. What we have to do is what is contained in the founding manifesto of the economic freedom fighters. We need to repossess South Africa's land without compensation, the whole of South Africa. We should repossess, we must expropriate land without compensation, because those that took the land from us did not pay, they never negotiated anything. We need to nationalize the strategic sectors of the economy, the banks, the monopoly industries, the mines, so that we can equally benefit from the economy of South Africa. We should provide fee-free education for all, at all levels. We should actually incentivize those that are seeking further education at postgraduate level. We need to have a thinking nation. We cannot lead if we are not paying detailed attention to the things that we need to deal with as a people, we must always be engaged in this particular activity. So we need free education, we need quality health care for all the people in South Africa, because the economy of South Africa is still controlled by those that did so before 1994. Why? Because they hijacked the agenda of the liberation movement. They took the agenda of the liberation movement. We can't be a generation that is still stuck in that particular period. That is why when we were in the Congress movement, we started with a program for economic emancipation, for economic freedom in our lifetime, which is finding proper expression organizationally now in the economic freedom fighters as a movement. And you would know that the reason why the liberation movement was very decisive in terms of exterminating that program is because they knew that it is going to turn upside down the agreements which they had reached with the capitalist establishment. And a lot of them had been co-opted into it. So they had to be very decisive to say, wait there, you want to nationalize what? You want to take the land for what? And then they exterminated in terms of what happened. We are still the oppressed and conquered majority. We are still the exploited majority. We have got no control of our economy. We need to raise our levels of consciousness from some degree of village or township or provincial consciousness. We need to have clear revolutionary national and internationalist consciousness. We need to fight for socialist reconstruction of society. And that can only happen by taking political power so that that power is given to the people. Now, comrades, all these things that we are saying here, we are compiling into a book, a proper, accessible book with accessible language, which all of you will be able to read. If possible, that book must be made available to all so that we can enhance and harness our ideological and political understanding and where we come from. So, comrades, thanks very much. We needed to go through these key highlights of where we come from as a people and where we are going. Let us continue to fight for economic freedom in our lifetime. And economic freedom can't be attained just in one country. There must be integration of the entire continent. We must push for the African agenda. We must unapologetically push a Pan-Africanist economic emancipation movement that is going to integrate the entire continent to develop all parts of the African continent. When we speak about African unity, it's not to say that we must all of us gather in South Africa because it has got economic interest. Capitalism in the continent makes it impossible for people to stay wherever they are because there is no economy there. Economy is concentrated in certain parts of the geographic area called Africa. Economic activity is concentrated in certain cities. But the socialist reconstruction of society is going to devolve economic expansion. That there is no need to migrate for economic purposes. People are migrating because of economic purposes. If you want to migrate, it must be for many other reasons. It must be for personal purposes. Maybe you're getting married there or there. But now people, because of the legacy of colonialism and apartheid, are forced to migrate because wherever they are, they can't benefit economically. So they have to go and generate income elsewhere. So the development of the African economy, that is clearly articulated in the founding manifesto of the EFF, seeks to achieve a program where there will be sustainable, productive economic activity in all parts of the African continent. The African continent is home to 60% of the world's arable land. We must produce our own food. We must produce our own industrial and manufacturing products. We must trade amongst ourselves so that we can begin to have true meaning of liberation. Because what we are experiencing now is the slavery continuing in another form. So capitalism is a continuation of slavery. And a racist, like capitalism globally, is racist. So racism and capitalism are two sides of the same coin. That is why there is nowhere in the world where black people are treated with respect. In America, in Britain, in Brazil, in India, in China, everywhere, black people are treated with disdain. We need to intensify a struggle that must emancipate all of us. And that struggle is the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime that is going to undo the compromises and the sell-out positions that were taken by the liberation movement when we're experiencing transition from apartheid to economic apartheid. What we have in South Africa is continuation of apartheid, economic apartheid in other forms. And all indications are there to show that that is not real, that is not sustainable. We need to defeat capitalism, and we must be unapologetic about that. Thank you very much, comrades. I'm sure that this would have added to our different understanding of South Africa. Everything else that we say is not something that we are generating in our own heads. It's things that we read. We're taking a leaf from Vladimir Lenin, who always emphasized that revolutionaries must always be advanced, must be the most advanced in terms of understanding the balance of forces and what is to be done. Thank you very much. We'll engage further and let the struggle continues. Amandla.